Sidney Crosby was one of the most hyped prospects the NHL has ever seen. Fresh off of a lockout, all 30 teams in the NHL had a chance to win 2005's Sidney Crosby sweepstakes. Among the teams with the highest chances of winning were the Pittsburgh Penguins. Their 6.3% chance proved to be enough to land the league's next generational talent. For well over a decade now, Sidney Crosby has been the NHL's greatest superstar. He's been at the forefront of the league's image because of his total dominance, both individually and as a part of the Penguins. He's been there for Pittsburgh time and time again, lifting the franchise and even the city both on and off the ice. He has become the Pittsburgh Penguins, a player so closely associated with them that you can't possibly think of the franchise without thinking of him, and vice versa. Today, we look at how Sidney Crosby has saved the Pittsburgh Penguins throughout all the different stages of his incredible career.
It is my somber duty to report that at today's meeting, the NHL Board of Governors unanimously reconfirmed that NHL teams will not play at the expiration of the CBA until we have a new system which fixes the economic problems facing our game.
Spurned by disputes surrounding issues such as a hard salary cap, the league was ultimately put into lockout on September 16, 2004. The collective bargaining waged on for months before eventually, in February, the remainder of the would-be season was cancelled. Financially, the league was in a pretty rough position. The NHL reported a loss of $273 million in prior years, claiming that only 11 of 30 NHL franchises were operating profitably. The NHL themselves were not specific in which franchises were non-profitable, but evidently, Pittsburgh was one of the unfortunate franchises. The franchise was no stranger to financial troubles. The team had declared bankruptcy in 1998 under the stewardship of owners Howard Baldwin and Roger Marino. If not for franchise legend Mario Lemieux's desire to keep the team in Pittsburgh, having stepped in himself with investors to purchase it, they very well may not have been the Pittsburgh Penguins by the time the lockout rolled around. But they were, and while it was better than not having a team at all, things were not going well. The Penguins' average attendance was thousands below their maximum capacity year by year. In 2003-2004, the year before the lockout, they were last in league attendance. Fans weren't turning up, and the biggest part of that is the on-ice product. In the 3 seasons prior to the lockout, the Penguins finished bottom 5 every year. Going into the lockout, there was some hope for the future. On NHL ice, their hopes were built around first overall pick Marc-Andre Fleury, who was kind of thrown to the wolves in his first NHL season. He sat well below league average save percentage and had an abysmal record. Even though he had massive potential, it was clear Fleury wasn't going to be enough to turn around the franchise on his own. The Penguins' last place finish in 2004 allowed them to get another top pick. They were leapfrogged by Washington for first overall, but still came away with the second overall pick. They used that pick to select Evgeny Malkin. While it seemed there was potential in Pittsburgh's future pieces, it was hard to be too optimistic watching the NHL roster. The team needed a true superstar, a franchise savior that could help bring the Penguins back to glory. Could Fleury become that player? Could Malkin become that player? Maybe, but the fans were looking and hoping for somebody else. When the lockout ended in the mid to late summer of 2005, everyone was thrilled to be getting things back underway. The fans got to watch their favorite teams again, the owners got to make their millions again, and the players got to return to playing in the world's best league again. Many had spent their seasons in one of Europe's various leagues, or the AHL if they were still eligible. Dedicated fans spent their time following those leagues for the year, or following the supposed best prospect of a generation. Because, over in Quebec, there was plenty of talk about the next one, Sidney Crosby. Ahead of the 2005 NHL entry draft, Sidney Crosby was being hyped as the best prospect in NHL history. Crosby ripped apart the QMJHL with the Rimouski Oceanic. He led league scoring by a 52-point margin and guided Rimouski to a Memorial Cup final. He had also participated in the 2005 World Juniors Championship. As part of one of the most stacked rosters in World Juniors history, Crosby was instrumental in helping Canada bring home the gold with 9 points in 6 games. Crosby proved himself to be, essentially, a perfect prospect. Scouts praised him for being good, great, or elite at every facet of the game, even as an 18-year-old, in addition to his being a leader for a dominant junior hockey team. Safe to say, every NHL team wanted him, and because of the lockout, every team had a chance to get him. The 2005 NHL Draft Lottery was different to any other NHL Draft Lottery. Because the NHL didn't have the previous season standings to base the lottery order on, they used multiple previous seasons. Teams were weighted by playoff appearances ranging over the past 3 to 4 years. Every team got at least 1 ball entered into the lottery. 10 of those teams had 2 balls, 4 of those teams got the maximum of 3, and one of those teams was the Pittsburgh Penguins. As it would turn out, for the second time in 3 drafts, the Pittsburgh Penguins landed the first overall pick. And not for even a second was anyone entertaining that pick being anyone other than Sidney Crosby. The hype for Crosby after the draft was enormous. He was the immediate poster child of the new NHL, the salary cap era. Upon drafting him, Pittsburgh was immediately a relevant team within the NHL again. Before he even touched NHL ice, Sidney Crosby had already gone a long way in preserving the Pittsburgh Penguins. The Penguins had their lowest attendance in 20 years in the 2003-2004 season. When they won the draft lottery, Pittsburgh's season ticket sales boomed. And in Crosby's debut year, they surged to an average of nearly 4,000 more fans attending each game. The Penguins were even expected to be a great team, not just better than the year before, an actual playoff threat and cup contender. Before the season started, the previously last-placed Penguins held the joint 7th most likely odds to win the Stanley Cup, alongside the Vancouver Canucks. Every team above them in those preseason odds would go on to finish the season with 90-plus points in the standings. Pittsburgh finished the year with 58. While the Penguins disappointed, Crosby didn't. He broke the 100-point mark as an 18-year-old, becoming the 3rd ever player to do so. Unfortunately, he only got 4 first-place votes for the Calder Trophy. The voting was dominated by 20-year-old Russian winger Alexander Ovechkin, setting the stage for a lasting rivalry between the two. Rookie of the Year was one award Crosby would never receive in his trophy cabinet. Fortunately, the other awards were coming soon.
It was a telling moment. It was able to spring the franchise and the interest even tenfold more than what it had been. So it was a big moment in Penguin history, and it's one that everybody who follows the game and follows the Penguins knows about.
Pittsburgh was never a huge hockey market. Throughout much of the first 15-plus years of their franchise's history, they were an irrelevant team. In their city, when compared to the likes of the Steelers of the NFL and the Pirates of the MLB, fan support was lacking. Compared to the rest of the NHL, they were an afterthought, making the playoffs on occasion, but rarely threatening to challenge for anything significant. When Mario Lemieux was drafted first overall in 1984, things quickly began to change. The Penguins selected one of the league's most exciting players, and success followed soon after. Throughout the early to mid-90s, Lemieux helped establish the Penguins as a force in the league, winning the franchise's first 2 Stanley Cups. But as that era began to wind down, the franchise's flaws were amplified, with the lingering financial issues becoming more prevalent. Pittsburgh desperately needed a superstar to re-establish their identity, their reputation, as a premier franchise within the NHL. And with Sidney Crosby leading the way, the Penguins were able to do just that in Sid's second season. The Pittsburgh Penguins went from 58 points in 2006 to 105 in 2007, from second last in the league to 10th place overall. As good as he was, that big of a swing obviously couldn't be entirely attributed to Crosby. Second overall picks Evgeny Malkin and Jordan Staal both made their Pittsburgh Penguins debuts this year. These two helped form the spine of a center core that would last for over half a decade. Big second seasons in Pittsburgh from the likes of Sergei Gonchar, Ryan Whitney, and Mark Recchi were all huge contributors to the standing surge also. But while all valuable, no one player drove the Penguins forward more than Crosby. His 120-point season was enough to win him his first Art Ross trophy, Ted Lindsay, and Hart as league MVP. Still yet to even hit 20 years of age, Sidney Crosby had established himself as the NHL's best player and transformed the Penguins into must-watch TV. They bowed out in round 1 to the Ottawa Senators, but earned valuable experience to build on for next season. On May 31, 2007, Sidney Crosby was named captain of the Pittsburgh Penguins. This made him the 13th captain in Penguins history, succeeding Mario Lemieux. It also made him the youngest captain in NHL history, at least at the time. This honor came with the expectation that the Penguins would be contenders under Crosby's new reign, and in the years that followed, they were, perhaps the very best in the league. In his first 2 seasons as Pittsburgh Penguins captain, Crosby played in 8 playoff rounds. The first 4 set of those culminated in a Stanley Cup Finals series against the Detroit Red Wings. Led by the likes of Pavel Datsyuk, Henrik Zetterberg, and Nicklas Lindstrom, the Wings were an older team, benefiting from experience that the Penguins didn't yet have. Crosby scored 6 points in the 6-game Cup Finals series, but it wasn't enough to overpower the President's Trophy winning Detroit Red Wings, who claimed their franchise's 11th Stanley Cup. In an NHL commercial released after the series' conclusion, Crosby expressed his sadness over the series' loss, but he also said that the result would make the team stronger. The Penguins were expected to come right back with a vengeance. The next year, the Pittsburgh Penguins were right back in the Stanley Cup Finals, right back up against the Detroit Red Wings. While the Wings finished 3rd in the NHL in the regular season, the Penguins arguably entered the playoffs as the favored team. The Penguins had moved on from Cup finalist coach Mike Therrien in February, and since replacement Dan Bylsma took over, the Penguins had a combined regular season and playoff record of 30 wins and 14 losses. The two powerhouses went to war, and as expected, it came down to the very last game. Even within that game, it came down to the very last minute. The Penguins were able to survive the final flurry put on by the Red Wings, and in the end, Sidney Crosby claimed his first Stanley Cup. His 31 points in 24 games weren't enough to win the Conn Smythe Trophy behind an unbelievable 36 points from teammate Evgeny Malkin. However, Crosby was, of course, at the center of it all, the man credited, whether fairly or not, as the one with the most responsibility in bringing the Stanley Cup back to Pittsburgh. Sidney Crosby was the focal point of the first Pittsburgh team without Lemieux to win the Stanley Cup. If he hadn't done it already, the Cup win brought Pittsburgh's reputation back to that of a superpower within the NHL. Even the way it was won was somewhat reminiscent of Lemieux, with the two both reaching back-to-back finals. Lemieux did win both of his, but it only took Crosby 4 seasons to win his first Stanley Cup. At only 21 years old, Sidney Crosby was, by almost every metric, the best player in the NHL. His arrival had taken Pittsburgh from a boring, irrelevant, underperforming team to the league's most exciting powerhouse. While again, the success can't be entirely attributed to him, the player that fans were coming to PPG Paints Arena to see was Sid. In a remarkably short time, Crosby had established the Penguins as one of the league's most dynamic squads, and the organization's prestige would only continue to grow over the next decade.
When the discussion of all-time greats comes into play, Sidney Crosby has to be in that discussion. And you think about him coming into the league at 18 years of age, and at this point in his career, there has been no signs of any decline in his superstar status.
Sidney Crosby's legendary status has helped in elevating the Penguins to become one of the NHL's most prestigious franchises. It saved a legacy, erased the memories of many fans as to how difficult those aimless years entering the 2000s were. It created new fans, people who were drawn to Pittsburgh when Crosby emerged onto the scene. So many have been pulled into the allure of Crosby and the Penguins that the Penguins have become a global brand. The team has the most followers of any team in the NHL on Instagram, the most of any non-Original Six team on Twitter. Just over 20 years ago, there were fears that the team would be moved. Attendance was the lowest in the NHL, and franchise popularity was in the dumps. But in the social media era, they're one of the most popular franchises within the sport. And without a doubt, that's because of Sidney Crosby. Crosby's greatness captivated fans throughout the late 2000s and 2010s. He of course won that first Stanley Cup against Detroit in 2009, but by then, he had also won the Hart Trophy Ted Lindsay and Art Ross. By the time the Pittsburgh Penguins reached the Stanley Cup Finals again, Crosby had claimed another 6 major individual awards. He had registered over 500 additional points in the regular season and 70 in the playoffs. And he produced one of the most iconic moments in hockey history. When the Penguins matched up against the San Jose Sharks in the 2016 Stanley Cup Final, Sidney Crosby was still only 28 years old. The San Jose Sharks star players may have been older, but unlike those first Detroit series, the Penguins had the experience. The Pittsburgh Penguins would win the Stanley Cup in 6, then do it again the very next season. Crosby made up for the missed opportunity in 2008 by going back-to-back 7 years later. Crosby won the Conn Smythe as playoff MVP both years. He was instrumental in every aspect of both cup wins. He drove play offensively, controlled play defensively, was there, whether they needed a clutch goal or a crucial face-off. The Penguins absolutely could not have done it without him. And before he had even turned 30 years old, Sidney Crosby was a 3-time Stanley Cup champion, 2-time league MVP, and Olympic gold medal winner. Sidney Crosby is now in what are likely the final few seasons of his career. He's given all that he has to the sport and continues to do so to this day. Crosby is among the oldest players in the NHL today. He is still among the best in the league, even 18 years after his debut season. In the 2023-24 season, Crosby was, at points, in serious consideration to be nominated as a finalist for the Hart Trophy. His eventual 42-goal, 94-point season lifted a struggling Penguins team to being only 3 points shy of a playoff spot. Even still, Crosby is holding the Penguins above complete mediocrity. Even more impressively, Crosby managed, in this year, to do something only the very best players all time have been able to do: equal a Wayne Gretzky record. Upon the conclusion of the season, Sidney Crosby clinched his 19th consecutive point-per-game season. No better stat exists to illustrate the legacy of a player who has been so good for so long. Sidney Crosby is the greatest player to ever play in the NHL salary cap era, with the only real competitor to that title being longtime rival Alexander Ovechkin. His multi-decade run of dominance has established him as an all-time great, and the Penguins as an all-time great franchise, possibly the most highly regarded today of those outside the original six. Crosby is pretty widely considered to be a top 10 hockey player throughout history. Some would go as far to rank him in the top 5, and you could probably find those who believe he's in the top 3. Sidney Crosby has been transformational to the sport, a positive impact on and off the ice that's been at the NHL's forefront for nearly 20 years. Sidney Crosby has saved the Pittsburgh Penguins franchise. He did it in the literal sense, right when he entered the NHL. The hype surrounding Crosby as a prospect brought in tons of fans and revenue to the franchise, and his ability on the ice kept that hype sustainable. He saved the reputation of the organization, turning the Pittsburgh Penguins back into the contender they had been throughout much of the 90s, during Mario Lemieux's prime years. And throughout their decade-plus of dominance, Crosby established a legacy for himself. A legacy as one of the best prospects ever, who lived up to the hype. A legacy as the best player in the modern NHL, and one of the best of all time. A legacy as a winner, hero, and champion. Few players have done more for the NHL and hockey than Sidney Crosby, and it's hard to believe anyone can do more for their franchise, for the Pittsburgh Penguins, than Crosby did.
Your captain, number 87, Sidney